My brother got everything: the house, the savings, the antique jewelry my grandmother left my mother, all of it. And I was given 30 days to pack my bags and get out of the home I had lived in for 3 years while I watched my mother die. But he had no idea what I had kept, and he had no idea who my husband was about to become. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand what I gave up. I was 29 when my mother was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's disease. I had just accepted a promotion at the marketing firm where I had worked for 5 years. I had a studio apartment in Denver that I loved, a boyfriend named Daniel who I was crazy about, and a 5-year plan that was finally starting to look real. I was not rich, but I was building something. I was proud of what I had built. My brother was 34. He lived in Phoenix with his wife, worked in commercial real estate, and made more money in a month than I made in 4. He had 2 cars, a house with a pool, and a lifestyle that looked very polished on Instagram. He also had one skill: I never developed the ability to disappear when things got hard. When my mother's doctor called a family meeting to explain what the next several years would look like, my brother flew in for the weekend. He sat in that office, nodded at the right times, said all the right things about family sticking together, hugged my mother in the parking lot, and flew back to Phoenix on Sunday evening. I drove my mother home. That was how it started. And that was how it continued for 3 years. I gave up my apartment. I gave up my promotion. I deferred the relationship with Daniel, who, to his enormous credit, waited. I moved into my childhood bedroom with a suitcase and a laptop, and I became my mother's full-time caregiver. I managed her medications, and by the end, there were 11 of them. I drove her to every neurologist appointment, every physical therapy session, every follow-up, and every scary conversation with doctors who were gently preparing us for what was coming. I bathed her when she could no longer do it herself. I cut her food. I held her hand through the nights when the tremors were so bad she couldn't sleep. I learned more about Parkinson's disease than I ever wanted to know, and I applied every single piece of that knowledge to keeping my mother comfortable and dignified for as long as possible. My brother called on Sundays, most Sundays. He sent a fruit basket at Christmas. He visited 4 times in 3 years. The first visit was right after I moved in. The second was Thanksgiving of the first year, when my mother was still doing relatively well and the visit felt almost normal. The third was when the doctor said we were entering the final stage, which I think scared my brother enough to book a flight. He stayed for 6 days that time, and I will give him credit, he was present during those 6 days. He cooked. He sat with her. He cried with me in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. I thought maybe things were going to change. The 4th visit was for the funeral. In the 18 months between that 3rd visit and the funeral, I did not have a single day off. I want you to understand what that means. Not a weekend, not a holiday. There was a home health aide who came 3 mornings a week for 4 hours, and those 4 hours were when I grocery shopped, ran errands, and occasionally sat in my car in a parking lot and just breathed. That was my life. And I am not telling you this to ask for sympathy. I made the choice. My mother was my mother, and I loved her, and I would do it again. I am telling you this because it is the foundation of everything that happened after. My mother passed on a Tuesday morning in October. It was quiet. I was holding her hand. The hospice nurse was in the room. I had been awake for 31 hours. I called my brother. He flew in 2 days later. The funeral was handled mostly by me, with help from Daniel, who had by that point become a permanent fixture in my life, and who understood, without me having to explain, that the funeral arrangements were something I needed to do myself. My mother had specific wishes. I knew every one of them. My brother showed up with his wife, and they both wore very nice black clothes and greeted relatives I had not seen in years, as though they had been just as present as I had. I let it go. I was too exhausted to be angry. The estate lawyer's meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral. I did not think much about it. My mother had never been wealthy, the house was paid off, there were some savings, and there was the jewelry. I figured everything would be split evenly. It did not occur to me that it would be anything else. I remember the exact moment I understood what was happening. The lawyer, a quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses, opened the document and began reading. My brother sat across from me. His wife was not present, she had stayed at the hotel. Daniel was not present either, because the lawyer had specified immediate family only. The house went to my brother. The savings account, approximately $67,000, went to my brother. The jewelry went to my brother, with a note that he could choose to gift pieces to family members at his discretion. I received my mother's car, which was a 2016 Honda Accord with 94,000 miles on it, and a jewelry box that contained a pearl necklace and 2 rings that had no significant monetary value. I sat very still while the lawyer finished reading. My brother did not look at me. Then the lawyer mentioned one more item. There was a note my mother had written, attached to the will, intended to explain her reasoning. The lawyer asked if I wanted him to read it aloud or if I preferred to read it privately. I said aloud. The note said that my brother had a family to support. It said that he had a mortgage and responsibilities. It said that she knew I was young and capable and that I would land on my feet. It said she hoped I understood. It did not mention the 3 years. It did not mention the medications or the appointments or the nights I spent on the floor beside her bed when she was frightened. It did not mention anything I had done at all. My brother reached across the table and put his hand on my arm and said, "I know this is hard." I picked up my purse. I thanked the lawyer. I walked out to the parking lot and I called Daniel and I said, "Come get me." And I sat on the curb until he pulled up. He did not say anything when he got there. He just got out of the car and held me, right there in that parking lot, for a long time. Then, he drove me home to my mother's house, the house that was no longer going to be mine, and he made dinner, and he sat with me while I cried. The next morning, my brother came downstairs. He was staying in the house during the estate transition, and he set a piece of paper on the kitchen table in front of me. It was a move-out notice. 30 days. He said he and his wife had decided to sell the house. He said the market was good, and they didn't want to wait. He said he was sorry about the timing. I looked at that piece of paper. I thought about 30 days. I thought about the fact that I had no apartment, no active job, a resume with a 3-year gap that I would have to explain in every single interview, and approximately $4,200 in my checking account. I said, "Okay." He looked surprised, like he had expected a fight. He said, "Are you sure you're all right?" I said, "I'm going to be fine." And then I went upstairs and I called Daniel, and I told him everything. And Daniel, who is an attorney, not a family law attorney, he does corporate litigation, but an attorney nonetheless listened to every word. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did your mother have the same doctor for the past several years? Or did she change providers?" I said she had the same neurologist the entire time, and the same general practitioner. He said, "I need you to think very carefully. In the last year of her life, particularly in the last 6 months, how was her cognition? Did the doctors ever document any concerns about her decision-making capacity?" I went still. Because here is the thing about Parkinson's disease that most people don't know until they're living with it. In the later stages, it can affect cognition, memory, judgment. My mother had good days and bad days. There were months where she was completely herself, but there were also months where she repeated conversations, where she got confused about what year it was, where she sometimes thought my brother was still in college. The will had been updated 14 months before she died. I told Daniel this. He said, "I need you to not touch anything in that house. Don't throw anything away. I'm coming over." What followed was 3 days of Daniel going through every piece of paper in my mother's files while I helped him understand the context. He was systematic about it in a way I could not have been on my own. I was still grieving, still barely functional. He made lists. He photographed documents. He called a colleague of his who specialized in probate and estate litigation and described the situation. Then he sat me down and explained what he believed had happened. My mother had updated her will during a period that her own medical records suggested she may have had compromised decision-making capacity. The neurologist's notes from that period flagged cognitive fluctuations. There were 2 documented incidents in the 6 months prior to the will update, where she had made what the doctors called uncharacteristic decisions. She had tried to cancel her physical therapy, which she had always been committed to, and she had called the bank to remove me as her emergency contact without any explanation she could later recall giving. Someone had taken her to the attorney who drafted the updated will. The appointment had not been made by me. I had not known about it until the reading. Daniel said, "I think your brother knew about the update. I think there's a reasonable question about whether he facilitated it." I thought about the third visit, the 6 days he spent here, nearly 2 years ago, the long conversations he'd had with my mother alone, in the living room, while I was running errands during the aide's hours. I thought about him putting his hand on my arm and saying, "I know this is hard. I filed a will contest. I want to be honest with you about what the next several months looked like, because it was not a movie montage. It was exhausting, and it was expensive, and there were weeks where I genuinely did not know if it was going to work." Daniel and I had gotten engaged by this point, he proposed quietly, at home, with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and I said yes without hesitation, and we were splitting our time between his apartment and the task of fighting this case. I had found freelance work to keep money coming in. I was not sleeping well. My brother hired an attorney immediately. His position was that the will was valid, that my mother had been of sound mind, and that her decision to leave the house and assets to him reflected her genuine wishes. His attorney sent a letter suggesting that my contest was motivated by greed and that I was disrespecting my mother's memory. I kept every letter. Our attorney, Daniel's colleague, whose name was Patricia, and who was one of the sharpest people I have ever met, filed a petition arguing lack of testamentary capacity and undue influence. She subpoenaed my mother's medical records. She requested documentation of when and how the attorney's appointment had been scheduled. She deposed my mother's neurologist. The neurologist was careful, as doctors are, about making absolute statements, but under questioning, he confirmed that my mother had been in a period of notable cognitive fluctuation at the time the will was updated. He confirmed the documented incidents. He confirmed that patients in that stage of Parkinson's could present as coherent in casual conversation while having significantly impaired judgment in complex decision-making. Then Patricia found something that changed everything. The attorney who had drafted the updated will had a note in his file indicating that the appointment had been scheduled by a third party calling on behalf of my mother. The phone number on file for that scheduling call was not my mother's number. It was not my number. It was a number registered to my brother's wife. My brother's attorney tried to explain it. They said his wife had simply been helping to coordinate, that my mother had asked her to make the call, that there was nothing improper about it. Patricia pointed out that no one had informed me, as the person living with and caring for my mother full-time, that any such appointment was taking place. She pointed out that I had not been present. She pointed out that the timing aligned precisely with my brother's 6-day visit. The mediation happened on a Thursday in March. Daniel drove me there. Patricia met us in the lobby. I wore a blue blazer that Daniel had bought me because he said it made me look like I was ready to win, which made me laugh even though I was terrified. My brother walked in with his wife and his attorney, and he looked at me across the conference room table, and I could tell he had not expected me to actually go through with this. For most of my life, I had been the one who kept the peace, the one who let things go, the one who said okay and meant I'm not okay but I don't know how to fight. He had counted on that. I think he had always counted on that. Patricia laid out our case methodically and without drama. Medical records, the scheduling call, the timing, the pattern of my brother's involvement, the absence of any notification to me. She was not loud about it. She did not need to be. Halfway through the presentation, my brother's attorney asked for a recess. They were gone for 40 minutes. When they came back, the dynamic in the room had shifted in a way I felt before anyone said a word. They offered a settlement. It was not the full value of the estate. Patricia had prepared me for this, she said. A full recovery was possible, but a settlement was more likely, and that a settlement could still represent a just outcome. We negotiated for 2 hours. In the end, my brother agreed to pay me $140,000, which represented my share of the home equity based on current market value, plus a portion of the savings account, plus the appraised value of the jewelry that had been designated to him. He kept the house. He kept some of the savings. His wife did not look at me when they signed. I did not feel triumphant when I walked out. I felt something quieter than that. I felt like something that had been pressing on my chest for a very long time had finally lifted. Daniel took my hand in the elevator and said, "You okay?" I said, "I think I actually am." We got married 4 months later. Small ceremony, 23 people, a restaurant we loved, no drama. My maid of honor was my college roommate. Daniel's best man was his younger brother, who flew in from Seattle and cried during the vows, which made everyone else cry too. My brother was not invited. His wife was not invited. Neither of them reached out on the day, which was fine. Several relatives on my mother's side called me in the weeks leading up to the wedding, wanting to weigh in on the family situation. A few of them took my brother's side. A few of them were kind. I was polite with all of them, and then I returned to the business of planning a wedding and building a life, which was a much better use of my energy. With part of the settlement, Daniel and I put a down payment on a house. It is smaller than my mother's house was, and it is nothing like the house my brother has in Phoenix, and I love it more than I have words for. I planted a garden in the backyard. I have a home office where I took a full-time remote position that is better than the one I left 5 years ago. I am 33 now, and the 5-year plan looks different than the one I had at 29, but it looks like mine. I kept one thing from my mother's house that my brother did not notice and did not inventory. On the top shelf of the hall closet, behind a stack of board games, my mother had kept a shoebox. Inside the shoebox were letters she had written to me over the years and never sent, going back to when I was in college. I found them during the last month of her life, when I was cleaning out the closet to make space for medical supplies. I read some of them to her, and she smiled, and we cried a little, and she held my hand and said, "You always showed up." I have the shoebox on my bookshelf now. I don't open it often, but it's there. My brother called me 7 months after the mediation. He said he had been thinking about things. He said he wanted to talk. He did not apologize. Exactly, he said. He thought we had both handled the situation imperfectly, which is the kind of thing people say when they want credit for accountability, without actually offering any. I listened to him. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him I wasn't ready to have a relationship with him right now, and that I didn't know if I ever would be, and that I needed him to respect that. He said, "I just don't want us to lose each other." I thought about the fruit basket. I thought about the Sunday phone calls. I thought about 4 visits in 3 years and a move-out notice 30 days after our mother's funeral. I said, "I think we lost each other a long time before all of this." He didn't have anything to say to that. I don't carry anger about it anymore, or at least not in the way I used to. What I carry instead is something clearer, an understanding of my own worth that I had to fight to learn. I spent 3 years showing up for someone I loved, and I am proud of that. I spent months fighting for what was fair, and I am proud of that too. I built something on the other side of all of it, and I did it without anyone handing it to me. If you are in a situation where you feel like the person who always shows up, the one who gives the most, and gets considered the least, I want you to hear this. That does not mean you have to accept whatever is left over when the dust settles. You are allowed to know your own value. You are allowed to fight for it. And you are allowed to build a life that reflects it, even if the people who should have seen it never did. I showed up for my mother every single day. She knew it. She said so, in letters she wrote and never sent. And I carry that. The rest I let the lawyers handle.